Okay, hi. So we were talking about labels not too in the previous episode, and here's where I want to go into a little bit more depth about some of the issues that regarding labels and what you should be looking for, and perhaps what you should be on the lookout for. So, to summarize the previous episode, there are certain things that we absolutely expect to see on a label. We expect to see the source material, whether it's molasses or cane juice or vesu or honey or neutral alcohol for that matter. Let's not pretend that anything made out of sorghum or any other sort of beets or whatever is considered a rum. That just doesn't work, and it shouldn't even come into conversation. We should know which country it comes from. We should know the distillery it comes from, or, from the brand name, we should be able to establish that. We should know that it's kind of like a nice thing to know what kind of still made it, whether it was a column still, an industrial column still, a Creole still, a hybrid still, or a pot still. They have different flavor profiles when they come out at the other end, so that's useful to know. And of course, we need to know the aging, right? That's actually a larger question than it seems, because we need to know what kind of barrels it was in, how long it was in there for. If we have a blend, what is the age of the blend? Not the average age, not the up to age, but the actual youngest portion of the blend should be disclosed. And it would be very helpful, especially in today's climate, whether we know where the aging took place. Now, sometimes it's all at the distillery. Sometimes it's all in some other place, like, for example, Europe, which we call continental aging. And sometimes a little bit of one and a little bit of the other. And sometimes it's mostly in one, but a little bit in the other. So it's kind of like useful to know this kind of stuff. And of course, we need to know the strength. Over and above all of that, a label should provide certain other minimum bases of information. One of those might be, for example, whether a particular kind of barrel was used to finish it for 3 months, 6 months, or whatever, and how long that took place. There's not quite that much agreement on whether something is double aged, like equal ages in two different types of barrels, or whether something is aged mostly in one and a little finish in the other. But that would be useful. We would like to know whether it is a blend we're looking at, whether it's a single barrel or some kind of Solera business, which I'm going to get into in more detail later. The Angel's Share is not something that very many producers or independent bottlers choose to present, but you know what? If you get it, it's a nice to have, but it's a second order kind of thing. And of course, for those proponents of disclosure in all factors, then we really should know if it's been added to in any way, whether it's been colored in any way, and whether it's been filtered in any way, because all of those things affect our perceived value of the end product. If something is absolutely and totally clean, nothing's been added, there's been no coloring, no sugaring, no dosage, no nothing, then we tend to have a bit more faith in it and are perhaps willing to pay a little bit more money. Those are the bases. But of course, in between all of this comes the whole question of things like misconceptions that to this day still dot the rumiverse. A good one is that, it comes from sugarcane, it should be sweet, or, all white rums are the same, or, there's just tons of these little things running around the place that kind of cloud people's minds. So I want to get into that, and especially since we're talking about labels, some of the things we do see on labels that are misleading, and some of the things we don't see on labels at all that would help us evaluate whether the product we're getting makes any sense. One of the most common lightning rods for this kind of thing is the number of whatever it is that's on the label. The poster child for this is the Zacapa 23. Now, this is not actually the Zacapa 23, but it's a Zacapa, and it's the Edición Negra. But everybody knows that famous 23 that is on the bottle label for the Zacapa, and there's been tons of stuff, including a lawsuit right now, that says, it's misleading to say that it's 23 years old when it's nothing of the kind. In point of fact, the Zacapa 23 is a blend of rums between 6 and 23 years old, using a Solera system, which some people doubt and say it's actually just a complex blend. But you see where this sort of thing creates problems for people who don't understand what they're looking at. Look at the label very carefully. Another example of this kind of thing, and here I don't have a bottle, but I printed out a label, is the Flor de Caña. Now, they got into 10 kinds of shit for other reasons before, but one of the things that really pisses people off a lot is the way they just put a number. They changed this about 7-8 years ago, and instead of saying something was 7 years old or 12 years old or 15 years old or whatever it was, they started to simply put the number, bam, 7, right? And then underneath that, they don't even qualify that in any way, but simply say slow aged. What the fuck does that mean? I have no clue to this day what slow aged actually means. What, they stopped time or something, or ran it through a black hole? Like, who knows? But it's misleading, because when I did some investigation on this many years ago, it seemed to me that they changed the age statement to be a NAS, a no age statement at all. And that 7 or the 12 or whatever it was actually supposed to be a blend of 7 different kinds of things. Nowhere stated. Right? Stuff like this you got to be aware of, because this is what erodes trust in a brand. If you hear that something is like 7 and you think that it's 7 years old, you got to pay attention. If it doesn't actually say years old, then you are within your rights to start questioning what on earth is it that you're paying all this money for. Right? And that goes all the way up to 25, which leads me to the whole question of Soleras. Now, Soleras are actually kinds of blends. I'm not going to go into the details of it. You could Google this and find it all out by yourself. But it really is a series of barrels in rows and every year a little bit of one is taken into the other, and the first one is filled up, and then, a little bit of this one is put into that one. And in each case, there's a progression of it. Now, the Santa Teresa Bicentenario, which I paid $300 for back in 2012 or 2011 or thereabouts, that actually claimed to have components of up to 80 years old inside it. The problem with Soleras is that you never actually are told what is the oldest portion of the blend and how much of the blend is that old. That, to me, is a really crazy problem, because you never know what you're paying the true money for. I mean, 99% of it could be 2 years old and you'd never know, because, well, that's how it's being marketed, right? So when you see something like Solera, with particular emphasis on the Zacapa 23, for example, or the Kirk and Sweeney, which has something very similar, right? They just call this thing a 12-year, but as far as I'm concerned, it's either a blend or a Solera itself. You got to just pay attention and ask yourself whether that's what you're paying your money for. And as long as you know, that's fine. The important thing is that you do know, right? There are other issues with labels as well. A good example is the origin story. I have an inbuilt distrust of labels that tout rather than actual information and data. They like to present something like this incredible origin stories of a barrel that was lost here or a barrel that was lost there, and people, just accidentally 15 years later stumbled upon it and it became so good that they had to make a special edition. Most of the time, this is just marketing speak. Regard these things with a little bit of distrust. One example that I found here in Calgary was this one, the Secret Barrel White Rum, because they talked about this mythical gentleman from down south in Crow's Nest Pass, who had this, he's probably the most interesting person in Canada because he did all these crazy things, and every now and then he popped up at the distillery and made these incredible small batches. Complete crap. Trust me on this, right? And therefore, origin stories are something to regard with extreme skepticism when you run across them. Another one, for example, is things like the term XO. Now, in brandy and in cognac, XO is, I think if I recall correctly, brandy, it's supposed to be about 10 years or old or greater. That's what the XO actually means, and it's defined. In rum, it's only defined within the agricole world, where, according to the AOCS, if I remember correctly, it's 6 years or greater. Right? But since not everybody adheres to the AOC, and since it's completely meaningless in the United States, where the Bayou XO comes from, you can pretty much be sure that the XO has very little meaning at all, especially since it's nowhere mentioned on the label itself. It is simply something there to tell you that it is supposed to be a premium product. And in point of fact, in this particular case, they call this the Bayou Rum Mardi Gras Premium Crafted Rum, and I think they even have the word limited in here somewhere, small batch rum from La Cassine, Louisiana. Okay, so small batch can only be small batch if there actually is a bottle number on this thing that says, it's one of, that says 600 bottles or 1,000 bottles or something. When it just states that without any further qualification, then what you're really being told is nothing. Right? Again, regard with skepticism. Navy rums are another example of this. This is Lamb's, which is a very popular brand, cheap brand in Canada. This one here is 40%, which immediately doesn't make it a Navy rum. But I imagine they thought that by pushing a whole bunch of stuff into a barrel and coloring it deep, a deeper brown than usual, they can kind of like pass it off as such. But really, it's a meaningless term unless it's qualified properly with the proper information, like 54.5 or 57%, depending on who you talk to, right? I've talked before about stuff like Corsairs and the Merchant Reserve and so on, and these things have all of this stuff about where it comes from and so on, but in such general terms as to be absolutely meaningless. This is also a reason why I distrust things like labels that either talk about premium without defining what premium actually means, or where there's no age statement, or whether they use words like limited or special edition. Now, St. Lucia Distilleries used to make this family reserve, I think it was, or the chairman's reserve, sorry, which still is a thing because, and that harkens back to a historical precedent. But in today's world, I doubt it really is made for the chairman and then kind of squirreled away in a limited batch to give to consumers. I seriously doubt that's the case, right? Premium and special editions need to have some form of cachet to be premium and be considered special. And far too often, what is on the label doesn't give you any such information whatsoever to prove that this is the case. Sometimes it's on the website, but you know what? Why bother go there if you can't see it on, in the store where you're buying this stuff from? So then there's the subject of big numbers, right? We've talked about the Zacapa 23 and the Flor de Caña's age statement. And of course, we've got this 12-year thing on the Kirk and Sweeney, but there are others. For example, there are a couple of brands out of Panama. One of them is the Malecon 25. The Malecon 25 is supposed to be a 25-year-old, but the problem with that is that the price was not indicative of something that is actually that old. It was at 40%. It was supposedly 25 years old, but they never told you from when to when that 25 years was. That's a bit of a problem. You don't have enough to go on there, right? The Dictador 1977, best of, didn't even have an age statement. And I think I reviewed the 1977. I was supposed to be, a decade or two old, probably more. But again, nothing was given there. So you're being asked to pay three figures for something that you can't establish the provenance of. And this is why having the correct information on the label is so absolutely vital for a neophyte consumer who's going in there for the first time and thinks price means premium. It actually doesn't. Premium refers to the quality of what's in the bottle, not the price that you're being asked to pay. Because I've had some 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds that are actually quite spectacular. Renaissance Distillery out of Taiwan is a case in point, and there's some stuff coming out of Australia that is absolutely bangers, that also costs a pretty penny, but is actually quite young. You got to watch your step with this stuff. I want to spare a note for this thing that I call relevance. And I mentioned this in the previous episode where I talked about the Equiano, which is supposed to be an homage to Olaudah Equiano, who was part of the abolitionist movement in Great Britain in the late 1700s. And I've actually read the book that he wrote many years ago. My mother gave it to me. She was a librarian, if you care to know. But the reason why it's considered to be something special is not just because it marries Foursquare to Mauritius rums and then you're being asked to pay a little extra because part of it goes to a charity that is part of the bottler's charitable efforts. And that's all fine. But is the rum itself worth that? I don't know. Are you being asked to pay for the charity? Are you asked to pay because it's relevant to today's woke climate? It's hard to tell, but you should be aware of what's going on there and whether it really is that special. I didn't think it was, but I understand the marketing behind it completely. So those are some of the issues that we have with respect to danger signals. Perhaps one of the worst things to come out on labels is when you see something that says up to. And this is why when you look at an age statement and you think that that's what you're paying the extra price for, you've got to be so very careful. When you see something that says we have rums up to X years in this bottle, the problem is not the fact that you've got that, but that you're never actually told how much or what proportion of the blend is that old, which is the problem, as I mentioned, that I had with the Bicentenario and some of the others out there. I think that's actually misleading if you don't provide more information. And most of the time, people look at the price and then look at the label, or look at the label and then look and see whether the price justifies that. All I'm saying is that one has to be a little bit skeptical, a little bit careful, because we've been taken for a ride far too many times with neutral alcohol that's been doctored up with additives and so on and being sold at some kind of premium. And you've got to be so careful with this kind of stuff, which is why a little bit of information goes such a long way. A good example of this was the original version of the Ron Maha, which was supposed to be a Salvadorian rum. Now, this is something that I tried back in 2014. And I got to tell you, on paper, it looked really fine, except that once you started digging into the details, you realized that it was made in Panama, it was distilled in Panama, it came from Panamanian molasses that came from Panamanian sugarcane. And the only thing that actually came from El Salvador up to and including the bottling, was the original recipe that came from a Salvadorian family. Now, I do suspect that by now they've kind of like actually established themselves in El Salvador, but it goes to show that if you don't pay attention, then you could be getting something that you think is this, but is actually that. And that's a bit of a problem for me. Again, this is where I like independent bottlers a lot. They have a lot more to lose because of their small market share and their minuscule output. They don't have time to frig around. They give you everything right up front. And if they don't on the label directly, and most of them do, you tend to get a lot of it on the websites. And the Europeans are really good at this kind of stuff, with the possible exception of Cadenhead with their Green Label series. And you're never actually quite sure what you're getting with that, right? And of course, I've talked about Old Monk and their blend, which you're never quite sure what it's made of, and they don't disclose that, and so on. These are all danger signals. And again, I cannot emphasize enough that it doesn't mean the rums are necessarily bad ones, but it does allow you to evaluate whether the price you're being asked to pay is commensurate with the sort of information and disclosure that's given on the label. And that's why I consider labels to be absolutely the first line of defense, where producers cannot be fucking around. This is where they have the chance to hook you right away with the absolute truth and information of what it is that they're providing. And if they don't do that, then they have broken faith with you. And as I've noted before, and as Plantation found out to their cost, and a number of others have also, the moment that trust is lost, it's like you never want to buy their stuff in. And that has significant impacts on marketing in the future. It has impacts on the amount of sales that you can make, unless you're selling to the mass market, in which case most people don't care. But it is something that I believe we should pay more attention to. Over and above all of that, I do believe that there are certain minimum criteria that we need to see on labels. I've discussed them at the very beginning of this. It does kind of segue over into two other issues, one of which is value for money and the other one of which is classification. But those are way beyond the scope of this, which is already far too long. I've talked for like 17 minutes and so on. Okay, so this is a two-part series then on the subject of labels, on what I believe labels should provide at a minimum, what they should avoid doing, and what we ourselves should educate ourselves to pay attention to and understand, so that we know what we are buying and we know what we are getting. Because, and I gotta go come back to this is Richard Seale's first law, which is basically drink what you want, but know what you're drinking. And I think I couldn't have put it better myself in fewer words than that. That's it for today, and I hope you enjoyed this two-parter, and I will talk to you next time with whatever else I've got on the go. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.